Hello, everyone, and welcome to the CGHE Global webinar for today. Today, we've got Achala Gupta with us, and I'll introduce her in a moment, but let me just take you through the webinar protocols at the start. Firstly, be warned that the webinar is being recorded and your immortal questions and answers will be up on YouTube for eternity. We usually post the webinar within a couple of days of it being held. The transcript of the chat conversation is also available through our website. Now, during the webinar, please keep yourself muted unless you have been asked to speak or ask a question. There's no need to have your video on during the webinar, but please turn it on when you're asking a question. We recommend using the speaker view so you can more clearly see who is talking. To ask a question, use the chat function. Write out the question you wish to ask. We find this is very valuable in ensuring that we give everyone the best chance of being heard, and we arrange the questions in an order which works best for the presenter. So what will happen is at the end of Achala's presentation, if your question is selected, you'll be asked to ask itself on camera in the webinar, but I'll give you a warning by writing to you in the chat to say your question is coming up next or something like that. So when you receive the invitation to come in and ask your question, please unmute yourself, most important. Switch on your video and do the thing that everyone forgets to do, which is state your name and where you are from, so then we know where the question's coming from. Okay, let's move into the business part of today's webinar. So let me introduce to you Achala Gupta, who over the weekend has just moved from London to Surrey, where she's starting in sociology as a research fellow. Previously, she was at the UCL Institute of Education, which many of us have worked at some time in our career. Her current research focuses on education delivery systems and the processes of social reproduction. Achala manages the student strand of the ESRC funded, I think it should be, yeah, Euro Students Project led by Rachel Brooks, which was presented, we had 2 papers from that project already in our webinar series, and I should imagine there's probably more to come after this. Achala, let me hand over to you, and thank you very much for coming in today.
Thank you very much, Simon. So I'll start sharing my screen. Right. I hope you can see it. Okay. So this particular presentation is a part of the Euro Students project, and I would be talking more specifically about higher education students' aspirations for their post-university lives, and would be doing so by providing evidence from 6 European countries. So a little bit of background before I delve into the findings. In a speech given on the 9th of July 2020, Gavin Williamson, the UK Secretary of State for Education, and outlining reforms for post-secondary education, asserted that, and I quote, "We must never forget that the purpose of education is to give people the skills they need to get a good and meaningful job," unquote. While this comment was roundly criticized by many of those working in education for its overly narrow perspective, it is broadly representative of the assumptions that appear to underpin many higher education reforms introduced across Europe over the past decade. These have included obliging students to move more quickly through their studies so that they are able to enter the labor market sooner, encouraging employers to have a more direct input into curricula and sit on the governing boards of universities, tying text data to specific degree programs so that prospective students are aware of their likely future earnings, incentivizing students to take up places on STEM courses on the basis of ostensible employer demand, and reducing the number of places available in subject areas that are deemed not to serve well the labor market. Moreover, students have also often been positioned discursively as first and foremost future workers within many higher education policy documents. To a large extent, the academic literature on students' aspirations and post-higher education trajectories has mirrored this policy context. The vast majority have focused on aspirations for employment and the extent to which they are realized in contemporary labor markets. This has demonstrated that while higher education continues to play an important role in expanding horizons and facilitating access to well-regarded jobs in a range of different national contexts, transitions into the labor market are, even for graduates, often strongly patterned by social characteristics. Although scholars have focused on the impact of both gender and ethnicity, the most substantial body of work addresses the impact of social class, a body of literature that many of you are very well aware of, so I wouldn't delve further into it. It is not always the case, however, that students' social characteristics determine their employment outcomes. There is evidence that in some circumstances, the institution attended can be a stronger predictor of a student's job prospects. Pathmaker and colleagues study published in 2016, based on research in 2 higher education institutions in the UK in the same geographical area, but of different statuses, indicated that those who attended the more prestigious institution had a strong advantage when entering the labor market and irrespective of their social background. They explain this in terms of employer practices that favor those who have attended elite universities. Other UK-based research has also shown a strong correlation between university attended and earning levels. Example would be Wakeling and Savage's work. While articulating with this body of work on the aspirations of higher education students, particularly in relation to postgraduate employment, this presentation also speaks to debates about the extent to which higher education systems across Europe have converged. Some scholars have argued that through initiatives such as Bologna Process, the creation of a European higher education area, and the impact of neoliberalization more generally, students' lives and perspectives have become increasingly similar across the continent. Other researchers have, however, suggested that despite these various initiatives and policies, national differences endure and the European space remain differentiated, at least as far as understandings of students are concerned. Indeed, focusing specifically on aspirations, Power and colleagues' work have revealed significant differences between graduates from an elite higher education institution in the UK, whose future plans centered largely on developing their own careers, and their peers at a comparable French institution who placed more emphasis on their social and civic duties. We are attentive to this debate in the rest of our presentation, exploring the extent to which different national contexts appear to shape the aspirations of the higher education students to whom we spoke. This presentation, therefore, contributes to the scholarship that has focused on higher education students' aspirations by examining the hopes of young people enrolled in degree-level study across Europe. It considers what they anticipated their higher education would lead to, and the extent to which such aspirations were similar across different national contexts, institutions, and subjects of study. So as I mentioned earlier, this presentation is part of the larger Euro Students project funded by ERC and led by Richard Brooks. And this presentation draws on data collected in 2017 and 18 through focus group discussions with 295 students in 6 European countries: Denmark, England, Germany, Ireland, Poland, and Spain. These nations were chosen to provide diversity with respect to welfare regime, relationship to the European Union, means of funding higher education, and extent of any financial support provided to students. Fieldwork was conducted in 3 higher education institutions in each country, chosen to represent the diversity of the respective national higher education sector. Focus groups were conducted with domestic students, all of whom were enrolled on an undergraduate degree program. We aim to include students from a wide range of disciplines and maintain diversity by including students from a variety of socioeconomic backgrounds. Students were asked open-ended questions about a variety of topics, such as their reasons for attending higher education, what they considered to be the purpose of higher education, and what they thought it meant to be a student in their particular societal context. In addition, their views about some common ways in which students are understood within the academic literature and in everyday discourse, such as future workers, consumers, political actors, and dedicated learners, were sought. They were also asked to make plasticine model, a kind that you see to the right-hand side of the presentation, to represent how they thought about their own identity as a student and how they believed they were thought about by other social actors. These questions and the prompts students were given elicited in various and significant ways data about their aspirations for their post-higher education lives. Given the relatively limited literature on students' own perception about why they hoped and believed their higher education experiences would lead, this constituted a key focus of our analysis. We drew on relevant data from across the focus group, rather than focusing on students' responses to one single question, exploring them deductively in relation to the literature discussed earlier and inductively by making use of the software package and Vivo. Now I will present the key research findings by theme in turn. When students spoke of their aspirations for their life after higher education and where they hoped their degree would lead, they outlined a considerable number of factors. In contrast to the majority of literature discussed earlier, many participants focused on non-economic factors. Some, for example, hoped that through their higher education, they would develop intellectually, gaining a more profound understanding of the subject that they were studying. For some students, this was linked explicitly to broader processes of personal development. These quotations are illustrative. While students from all countries in our sample placed emphasis on such plans, differences were evident in relation to the extent to which students framed their aspirations as part of a collective endeavor. In Denmark, Germany, and Poland, in particular, participants outlined hopes, not just for themselves, but for their wider community. They saw university as a time to develop the knowledge and the skills that would help further national development. It is interesting to note that the three countries where students more commonly articulated these collective aspirations were the ones where they were not required to pay themselves for their higher education, and in the case of Denmark, received a grant to cover their living expenses throughout the whole of their degree program. In such nations, because of these funding arrangements, the purpose of higher education is still sometimes understood as a public good. Nevertheless, despite this emphasis on various non-economic outcomes, it was also the case across the 6 nations that progression to employment was the aspiration that was discussed at most length in the focus groups. Students across all 6 countries spoke about obtaining a university degree as a crucial step towards future employment. Moreover, they believed that because of commonly held beliefs that higher education is a path to sought-after careers, members of society saw them as successful and accomplished through having secured a university place. Success in this context was seen as having better employment prospects. Indeed, within the focus groups, many students made plasticine models of arrows, staircase, and a compass to signify that their degree would provide an important pathway to their chosen field of work. There were, however, notable differences in how higher education was conceptualized in relation to this particular aspiration. Some students saw a degree very much as a clear route to their desired employment in fields such as journalism, medicine, and law, while others viewed it offering both the time and space to explore a variety of work-related options and to enable them to reach a decision about what they wanted to do with the rest of their lives. Differences between the students were also evident in the extent to which students positioned themselves as either investors, or insurers with respect to their employment aspirations. There was evidence of both framings, but viewing oneself as an insurer was more common. In one of the Irish focus groups, for example, one participant commented, and I quote, "What is taught nowadays is that you need a degree to get most jobs. Anything other than low-paying jobs, as far as I was educated anyway when I was at school." Unquote. Here we see students' aspirations couched largely in terms of avoiding the low-paying work to which they believed they would be confined if they had not embarked upon a degree. Such framings were particularly evident amongst our Spanish students, who often spoke about university education as a crucial means of avoiding unemployment, compared to students in other countries in our sample. For these students, joblessness was the major concern, which reflects broader economic conditions. At the time of data collection, the youth unemployment rate in Spain was 34.3%, the second highest of any EU country. In this context, it is perhaps unsurprising that university was seen by many of our Spanish participants as an insurance against poor labor market outcomes, rather than an investment in aspirations for high-paying professional employment. A further theme across all 6 countries was a belief that the ability to realize one's aspirations was closely linked to the institution one attended. Indeed, many participants highlighted the various ways in which they believed their likely employment outcomes would be mediated by societal assumptions about the status of their institution. In general, students from all types of higher education institutions and across the various countries in our sample believed that society, including employers, regarded graduates from high-status universities as more knowledgeable, super intelligent, and superior. This was, however, played out in rather different ways from country to country, depending on the structure of the national higher education system. In Spain, for example, students attending the private university in our sample held such views, indicating that society believes that they may be advantaged in the labor market when compared to their peers at public universities. In Denmark, institutional differentiation was played out rather differently. Indeed, students at a higher education institution that tended to employ more unusual pedagogical approaches believed that their degrees were not seen by society as equivalent to those from institutions that taught in a more traditional way. They claimed, students here from this institution aren't the most well seen upon students in the society. Some people think we are not specialized enough, that we can't be used for anything. Lots of people tend to think that we are just getting educated to go out to be unemployed. Here, the students clearly did not agree with such sentiments, but suggested they may nevertheless have a tangible effect on their ability to realize their aspirations. Moreover, students from a Danish University of Applied Sciences made reference to how such institutions were seen as inferior to traditional universities. In England and Ireland, students tended to differentiate between older and newer institutions, believing that transitions into professional employment would be much easier from the former. For example, focus group participants from a mid-ranking Irish university in our sample described how, despite the strengths of their degree program, they believed that their skills and knowledge were not obvious to employers, and thus they would have to expend considerable effort to demonstrate these, in ways that would not be required of students who had attended more elite institutions. In England, similar comments were made. In this extract, the student pointed out what they believed was a significant difference in the starting salaries by institution, irrespective of the particular skills graduates brought to their roles. While the majority of previous work in this area, at least that published in English, has tended to focus on the inequalities related to students in systems with a high degree of vertical stratification, such as the US and the UK. Our data suggests that students across Europe, even in much flatter systems with much less significant status differences between institutions, also indicated that their ability to achieve their work-related aspirations may well be mediated by the place at which they were studying. Students' narratives about their aspirations for employment were also strongly inflected with assumptions about the subject they were studying. Many of our focus group participants from all 6 countries spoke at length at what they perceived to be a lack of public understanding of non-STEM subjects and assumptions that if they were enrolled on an arts or social science degree, they would find it considerably more difficult to find a job on graduation. Indeed, a participant in one of the Spanish focus groups made a model of a stone to represent how she felt she was viewed by others. She then went on to explain, I have made a stone because sometimes I feel that the people studying political sciences, not just me, everybody, it's as if they didn't even know that the course existed. It's like a stone that's lying there and nobody sees it because the people don't know that it exists, nor what use it has. Students from all 6 countries tended to believe that in general society, subjects were positioned hierarchically, largely on the basis of the status of the job to which they were linked and or perceived earning potentials. For example, participants spoke about how those studying law and medicine were held in particularly high regard. This can be contrasted with a discussion among social work students in one of the German focus groups in which they noted the low status that tended to be attached to their subject of study and argued that this could be explained to some extent at least by the low status of social work profession. Moreover, education students in some of the Spanish focus groups commented that they were often seen as, and I quote, people who are not doing a serious degree, unquote. But then went on to argue that the individuals who view them in this way, and I quote again, do not attach the correct amount of importance to the task of the educator within society, unquote. This type of perspective was articulated most explicitly in students in one of the German focus groups. I'm just going to read it out loud. I think that the purpose of university education in our society has adopted a purely economic objective because we are seeing that humanities subjects are being scaled down and funding for the humanities has been drastically cut, whereas the STEM subjects are being pushed hard. And so only subjects that are economically relevant, important for a society, whilst other subjects are not. As noted previously, governments across the world have been trying to influence the aspirations of young people. In many nations, this has included various incentives to steer students away from arts and humanities into the STEM disciplines, in the belief that the latter are of more societal benefit and lead to higher salaries. There is certainly evidence from our research across Europe that many students were aware of such initiatives and also of public perceptions based on similar assumptions. However, we found little data to suggest that despite this awareness, students regretted their choices. Indeed, many seemed to have been aware of these views before choosing their degree programs. This suggests, firstly, that students have rather different views about the purpose of higher education than policymakers and other social actors. Although many were worried about their employment prospects, particularly if they were studying a subject that they believed to have low social status or visibility, this rarely affected how they valued their degree. They continued to hold on to the non-economic attributes of their higher education, even if they were aware that they were not often recognized by the others in society. Secondly, policies that aim to shape students' aspirations by pointing out salary differentials by subject may not be very effective in bringing about change given students' already considerable awareness of putative differences by discipline and their apparent prioritization of other concerns when making subject choices. So what we see here is the commonalities across Europe that is evident when we examine students' aspirations for their lives post-graduation. As we have demonstrated, students typically hope that their higher education would enable them to develop intellectually and personally, as well as facilitate a smooth transition into the labor market. While non-economic aspirations were articulated quite frequently in all countries, it was those that related to employment that tended to be foregrounded. This corresponds not only to the dominant emphasis within policy across Europe, but also the primary focus of the academic literature in this area, discussed at the start of this presentation. Moreover, such data tend to support, at least to some extent, those who have argued that important commonalities are now evident across Europe associated with the reconfiguration of European universities around an Anglo-American model. However, while this could be read as evidence of the further instantiation of a European learning space, as Lauren argues, our data indicate how aspirations were also sometimes shaped by particular national contexts. This is evident in, for example, the particular concern about labor market outcomes that emerged in the Spanish data, linked, we have suggested, to the high level of youth unemployment that prevailed at the time of the data collection. It is also manifest in the greater emphasis placed on collective rather than individual aspirations apparent in Denmark, Germany, and Poland. The three countries where higher education fees are still funded by the state and where, as a result, it is likely that discourses related to the importance of public education are more prevalent. Furthermore, we have shown how within nation states, many students indicated that they believed their ability to realize their aspirations might be affected by the institution they had attended, suggesting that the space of the campus can also serve to shape students' views about their future. Students' perception about the likely impact of institution on their employment aspirations were not confined to those in countries with strongly vertically differentiated systems where one might expect the rewards of higher education to be more variable. Instead, it appeared that students in all countries believed that employers and other social actors made judgments based on the institution of study, and that these could have a considerable effect on the labor market transitions. Finally, it is important to note that while most commonly articulated aspirations were those relating to employment, our participants certainly did not define their higher education experience solely in these terms. For the vast majority of the students we spoke to, a degree was significantly more than a qualification for the labor market, irrespective of whether they viewed themselves as investors or insurers. This was evident in the range of non-job related aspirations that they told us about, and perhaps most strikingly, in their cogent critique of the economic focus of government policy for higher education and what they perceived to be overly narrow societal views that often valorized courses linked to high status and well-paid careers and problematized those that had less obvious connections to particular jobs or that were associated with less well-remunerated professions. Here we see a much more expansive understanding of higher education than that which is implicit or often explicit in the pronouncements of policymakers across Europe. So if you would like to know more about this project, there's a website. We also have a very active Twitter account. So any of the research outputs that are coming in the future would be shared with the Twitter account, and I also have on the right-hand side my personal contact. Thank you.
And thank you, Achala. That was very useful, I think, and opened up a really important area of discussion for all of us. And perhaps goes as to the heart of the whole engagement of society and students in higher education, and not just the teaching and learning function, but really the whole experience of being there. But it also goes to what people do learn and what they become. And all of us are concerned about the debate, I think, the way in which it's become simplified and drawn in this dualistic way as a sort of opposition between economic value which is somehow the same for individuals and society, versus a kind of non-economic view. So you've got a situation where it's either it's human capital equation, human capital theory, or it's everything else, public good role of higher education, personal development aspects of higher education, so on, all put into this bag called non-economic and therefore of questionable value, which is, that's so problematic. And of course, what we have here is this vastly more complicated set of values, aspirations, collective and individual. And as you rightly pointed out, contextually variant, so that they're different for different disciplines, they're different in different institutions, they're different in different countries. And I would add to that point, they're different over time, so that if the pandemic starts to bite very deeply on graduate employment, of course, issues related to employability are going to come forward in people's minds. But what comes from your presentation and what we, I think, know from others as well, is that you can hold employment aspirations and you can hold personal development aspirations, and you can hold in your mind the desire to benefit society and be good for everyone at the same time. And those things aren't working against each other. And I think, our biggest job in this is to try and explain all of this more richly to the broader public and policy environment, as you've done today. Let me just throw one thing in for your comment, and then we'll move to other Q&A. It seems to me that we talk, when the instrumental versus non-instrumental discussion occurs, we talk about economic benefits, but a lot of the issues relate to status, and that comes through in your quotes, that people are talking in terms of esteem, in terms of esteem of society and their own self-esteem as being associated with the experience of being a student. And this is, you can say status is an individual property and not very attractive one, a bit like saying, I want more money, I want more status. That's not very attractive, but status is also about, it's got another side. It's about confidence and agency and that feeling of being able to stand up with pride in the world and, make a contribution as a human being. That's not altogether, just instrumental and selfish, is it? So, but it just strikes me that status is probably that hard sociological concept of status, which keeps coming up so often in education, might be one of the clues to making the debate more complicated and richer.
Yeah, absolutely. I think status is one of the things that, so one of the questions that we asked students was why they decided to attend higher education. So some of the students did specify that they wanted to have really the resources in a form of cultural capital, that they wanted to go out and talk to the people that they wouldn't have otherwise experience of talking to. They wanted to move out of their family and then expand their horizons in that way. In Denmark, for example, I remember quite a few students said that they wanted to be the smart, to know stuff quickly, to understand things, to be more critical, to be more intuitive. And those attributes were associated with the higher education, more generally speaking. So 100%, like it is a status, and it encompasses a lot of things that sadly are pushed aside as a non-economic factors, but actually is very critical aspect of higher education nonetheless.
Thanks, Achala. We've now got questions have started to flood in. I mean, from no questions 5 minutes ago, we've now got quite a number. That's the way that this works. So let me first bring in, I'm just bringing up the question now for myself, is Toshiyuki Yamazaki. Toshiyuki, can you hear me? Can you come in? And can you ask your question of Achala now?
Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay, so my name is Toshi and I'm studying at Tokyo Institute of Technology. And my question is very simple. So to what extent do you think particular lifestyles and life spaces beyond just, job choice that students wish to design post-graduation influence your participants' aspirations?
said, do you think particular lifestyles and life spaces? So as I mentioned during the presentations, for some students, it was very clear cut. Say, for example, one student says, I wanted to study journalism because I wanted to become a journalist. And they had the imagery of becoming a journalist, and therefore they saw university as a direct route to enter that space of work, if you will. Whereas for other students, it was more of a thought of improving their life chances, but they didn't have any particular straightforward response to what they wanted to do. So the response really was, we wanted to improve our life chances. So that's really floating in many ways. So for them, university was a space to figure out what they wanted to do in the future. So it's really the mixture. So I wouldn't say that there is a particular lifestyle that students wanted to acquire through higher education. It varied across samples and students across countries as well.
I see. Thank you.
Thanks, Toshi. Thanks for your question. And thank you, Achala. Akiyoshi Yanazawa, Aki, can you come in now, please?
Thank you very much. This is very, very interesting discussion. And I am really impressed that the youngsters surveyed in Europe is quite similar with the students in East Asia, like Japan. That I think that in my country, Japan, as well, that majority of the students are much more aspired for the life after the graduation as a real life, so-called. And rather than, of course, some students are really interested in the academic life and also the personal development. And my question is that in East Asia, especially in Japan, we have some very strong tendency that the students go to undergrad program directly from the high school without experiencing any working life, and then graduate, and then they go to the real life. So this means that there is a very big boundary between the study life until the undergraduate or the even master to the full working life. So that is some the stereotyped idea. So there, although the students are aspire to work or to get a job, they do not really know the real meaning or the real reality of the working life. And my impression of the European country, at least traditional one, is much more kind of combination of the working life and the study life. Means that some students start working first, and then they go to the university partly working and partly and some students are quite adult, like 30 years old or something like that. So this is my kind of traditional image. But my impression is that I didn't understand what types of the students are having the experience to work during or before the study, and or not. So could you explain that to what degree they have those working experiences, and also is the working experience make a difference between of the perspective of the student?
Thank you for your question. Yeah, so two things. First, does the working experience make the difference of their aspirations to the employment? We didn't have that evidence from our data, because majority of the students actually didn't have prior work experience. So they had completed their schooling and they had come to the university. There were a few mature students in our sample. So in the case of Ireland and in the case of Germany. So I recall one student from Germany who had done a vocational track after their schooling and had established career in engineering for 20 years and came back to the university to explore their horizon and was studying creative arts. So that was just one example, but majority of the students were freshers. If that makes sense. So another important point was working alongside studying that you talked about. That's somehow is mediated by social class as well. So majority of the students in, say, for example, Spanish case, who were working alongside studying, were coming from the more disadvantaged social background. So they had to work in order to sustain themselves. But at the same time, they were actually very much struggling to focus on their actual studies. In Poland as well, this was a culture that majority of the students were working alongside studying. But those students who were working in order to improve their employment upon graduation, so they were working with the people who they would see as future employers, for instance. So different countries, people were adopting different strategies in order to enter the labor market. This kind of privilege was not there for the Spanish students, for example. So it would vary by context. And I appreciate your question, but I think one solid answer that I can give is Europe seems to be as heterogeneous as Asia is from our sample. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Aki, and thanks, Achala. And we've got a great set of questions coming up. I'm going to take them in this order. Solomon Zawalde, Soyoung Lee, Jishu Chen, and then Heather Eggins. So I think we should have time for those four and possibly more. So let's hand over at this point to Solomon. Can you come in? Second question in 2 days, Solomon.
Thank you, Professor. Yeah, that is second question in 2 days. Yeah. Thank you, Achala, for a very good presentation on a very topical issue. And Professor Marginson has rightly pointed out, graduate employability will differ among countries across time. Okay, we understand that. I just want you to comment on to what extent the students in your study really understand that their choices are, either predetermined by social, political, economic factors like policy factors within their own countries versus an exercise of their own agency, their own agentic self. Do they have, to what extent do they understand how these two factors really play out? Because in reality, for some graduates, employability is as simple as having an uncle with a law firm or an auntie with a dental surgery, and they have employment, but a lot more complicated and difficult for other groups of students. So are there any difference across countries in terms of this understanding? To what extent are they aware how their choices can be affected by factors that predetermine their choices, and to what extent they can also exercise their own agency to make job choices?
Always a question. How much freedom do we have? How much freedom?
Thank you, Solomon, for the question. So one thing that I mentioned towards the end of the presentation was, even though students are very much aware of this push that in the policy, they themselves are less affected by it. So many sociology and political science students, particularly in the case of Spain, even though they were worried about whether or not they will get the kind of employment that they are looking for, they didn't have any regrets over choosing sociology or political science. They found it interesting, and they thought that they wanted to learn more about those subjects. And across focus groups, even in the most marketized system where you would assume students to be more instrumental, the case would be England, students were choosing the subjects that were of their interest. So, but at the same time, another thing is that students are very, very aware of these processes, larger processes, which might affect their choices, but they are, at least in our sample, didn't seem much worried about those, and did indeed exercise their agency in that regard.
Yeah, thanks, Solomon. That's a great question, I think. And thank you, Achala, for the answer. I'd like now to bring in Jishu Chen for the next question, please.
Sure. Thanks, Simon. And thanks, Achala, for this fascinating research. I'm Jishu Chen, a PhD candidate at LE UCL. And my question is kind of related to Solomon's question. In terms of the national variations of the students' perceptions of higher education as influence or investment, I'm wondering how the broader social context influence their perceptions. And how does the broader context intersect with, the institutional mediations and their own life histories and of course, their own agency? And so, yeah, I'm wondering the socioeconomic backgrounds and the level of higher education institutions take a role in this process. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeshu. And one thing that I can think of here is that students' experience of higher education, which is a separate topic, has a very close connection to where they're studying. So, for example, in the case of Spain that you asked more specifically, in the private university, students tended to, for example, talk about education for the sake of education, that they are there to learn, they are there to delve into this pool of knowledge, and those kind of suggestions were given. But broadly, if you see the Spanish data set, in public universities, students did not articulate the purpose of higher education and why they attended universities for these reasons. They seemed to be much more instrumental in that way, that they thought that we wanted to get a particular employment, we want to have a graduate employment, we want to have to be doing better off after they have received education. So there are differences on account of the experiences of higher education by institutions, but nevertheless, when the topic really was about what are you going to do after you have graduated, there were anxieties and concerns because of the larger context within Spain, where which is of youth unemployment at the time of data collection.
Mm. Yeah,
so it's more complex in that way than one would.
I've read a series of studies of student attitudes to the purpose of higher education in the United States over a 20-year period, and it was really striking how you get these large swings in the culture, so that you'd get a period where almost everyone was talking about personal development as the goal. And you get a period where everyone was talking about practicalities, about getting a job. That the whole youth cohort would seem to go through this sort of large scale change of attitude, which seems to reflect the larger discourse in society, I think, that's going on at the time, and probably, reactions to macroeconomic and political trends are playing a role in that. So, but you get a very clear sense that it's not just what individuals are saying, it's something that's combined and collective, and it's about, a relational environment, a relational discourse, and that shapes things. And that can vary from place to place, as you said. So can we bring in So-Young Lee at this point? And I have to declare an interest because So-Young is a very valued doctoral student of mine. So-Young is currently in South Korea, but she's normally enrolled at Oxford. So-Young.
Hi everyone, Simon introduced me already. So my name is So-Young, I'm in South Korea now. Thank you for your presentation, Achala. And my question is, so apparently students in your study are aware of the society's focus on the economic value of higher education. And it seems that they are also internalizing the focus of the society, but rather hesitantly, I guess, because as you said, that some social science students regret their choices, even though they chose the major by themselves for a personally valuable reason and their aspirations, which is not always economic. So hearing that the not serious major would affect how they see themselves, apparently, I guess. So what do you think it says about students' self-determining agency? I mean, how does the dominant instrumental approach to higher education and the hierarchy in disciplines acknowledged by the students themselves affect their student agency? I think this question is important because I believe that it is also a function of higher education to develop individual agency and freedom.
Yes, thank you for the question. One clarification, which might set the record right. Students talked about first of all, they did not regret their choices. So those who were from political science and sociology, say for example, in Spanish focus groups, they said this is how society and including employers might see them. So that didn't necessarily affect their own personal choices, that they didn't want to drop out. They were still very much enthusiastic about sociology and enthusiastic about their own stream of study, irrespective of the not so welcoming economic outcomes that they would anticipate. So I think that sort of clarification helps with answering the first question, and also the second question in many ways, because that's not their own views. It's the views that they think society has about them pursuing that degree program. They themselves did not think that that was a wrong call on their part.
Thanks, Sayong, and thanks again, Achala. Can we bring in Heather Eggins at this point? She has a question, Heather.
Yes, hello. Thank you for a very interesting talk. What I was thinking is that we've moved into an age of universal higher education in many countries, with over 50% of 18-year-olds at some point going to get a degree. I wonder if the getting of a degree is actually now central to the formation of a person's identity. They can argue then they have been through a rite of passage. And I wonder, because of this, if you think you've found any evidence for it, does that explain partially why governments have great difficulty in getting students not to apply for degrees, but to go off and be apprentices and take other forms of higher studies which are not called degrees?
Thank you, Heather, for the question. First off, I think in all the countries which are part of this study, the rate of participation in higher education is different. So in the case of Ireland, where many people go to universities, their students did talk about university education as a thing that you do, but not necessarily in the case of Germany, for example, where there is very established vocational track where students do go for apprenticeship. That's, for many, is considered as a natural thing to do. And indeed, this was also very interesting in our focus group, where Germany was the only country where, when we asked, why did you decide to enter higher education, the students did talk about a little bit why they didn't go for apprenticeship. So that was very interesting. In other cases, that this could be contrasted with Ireland, where that was not even a thought. So there are national variations, and therefore the extent to which degree would be considered as someone's personal identity would vary by countries. So that is more exact, probably answer that I can give. Thank you.
It's interesting that the UK is very much the same as Ireland. Yes.
I suppose so. And students did say that you have to have the aspirations. So for example, in the case of England, there's lots of discourse on aspiration building in the policy discourse, and which is something that students also talked about in the focus groups. And that kind of suggestion was not even, that kind of narrative was not presented in the focus groups of Denmark or in Germany or in Poland, because those discourses do not even occur at the policy level. So that's the reflection that you see in the students' responses as well, which mirrors to a large extent what is going on in policy.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thanks, Heather, and thanks, Achala. Very interesting. Now, at this point, I'd like to ask a question on behalf of someone, because Sin Yi Ko says that it's impossible to turn on the audio and the video. So the question is a technical question, Achala. It's a question about research. Could you share your reflections or insights on the project's cross-national comparative methodology and teamwork? I mean, how did that shape data collection and data analysis, the cross-national aspect?
I think one of the, it's important to do the comparative work in order to actually understand how even the same processes which might be occurring at the larger scale affect the things in everyday life. So if you have a comparative work ongoing, then the same thing, for example, neoliberalization, how it is taken up by different people and different social actors across higher education sectors in different countries, you can study that only through a comparative work. Another aspects about methodology and teamwork. Well, so this particular project is a multi-strand project, and I think it is a very rich data set. And when I joined the project in the first week probably of joining, and I joined from Singapore all the way, first thing that I said was such a beautiful data set. It's very rich, and where you can very easily compare how students, we are asking the same question, the purpose of higher education, are made sense of by students in Denmark very differently to how English students talk about it. So that kind of insight comes through the comparative work and adopting comparative methodology. And in terms of data collection, we collected data in English in England, Ireland, and Denmark. In other 3 countries, it was collected in their own language, and that data was later translated and transcribed. So that again, this kind of rich data set allows you to have a more in-depth inductive analysis, as well as deductive analysis of students' perspective, or not just of a student's perspective, but how these perspective of students, which themselves are very heterogeneous, speak to the perspective of staff, media, and policymakers and in the policy documents. So that kind of analysis you can do through the comparative methodology. It's a complex project, but also beautiful in terms of data that we have, and therefore interesting outputs, I hope.
Indeed, and publishable ones too. I mean, at this point, I might ask another question of you, and try to this asks you to step outside the project to some extent. I mean, as you know, in the UK, there's a discussion going on about elevating non-university routes to tertiary and higher education training, and aspirations seem very centred on the university sector in the UK. And there's a whole history, of course, that says that further education's been downgraded, underfunded, treated as second rate by policymakers, by the society, by employers, and so on for a very, very long time. What do you think are the triggers in terms of developing a richer set of options? A situation where, for example, someone like you or me or any of the people in this webinar could aspire to do a further educational technical training course alongside a university degree, and see them both, as people do in Germany, as useful to do, and worthwhile, and enriching and enabling and creating agency and opportunity. How do we get to that kind of situation in a country which is has treated higher education as reproductive of class, and has put university education for the upper middle class as the aspiration, and everything else is subordinated to that? How does that shift? Is there any clue in your data set which can start to tell us what could change people's minds? Or is it something that has to come from policy and from above?
So from the student's perspective, there wouldn't be a solution that you probably are seeking. But one thing which is very clear is that across all the focus group, students did critique the government policies in different ways. So in the case of Denmark, for example, students were very critical of speeding up the process. There were a discussion in one of the universities where a student commented, these policymakers want us to complete so soon. How much time did they take when they were in the university? So they, for example, critiqued that you want students to learn and learn for personal development, but within a certain period of time and in that particular way. So they were more skeptical about those changes which were happening. So I suppose there were, I suppose the students, one thing that came out of this data set was really that the one way that we look at students is that they are very instrumental. They go for higher education to gain labor market outcomes, really. But that's not something that we see in the data set. Students did articulate higher education for a variety of other reasons, the personal development and improving their own sense of being sometimes. Because, and this was something which was talked about also in Germany, where students said, if you are going to a particular school track, you are exposed to a certain group of people. But when you are in the university, you are meeting a diverse range of people, and therefore you are developing not just of your identity as future worker, that this is the profession that I want to go into, but as an active citizen and as a political actor. So I think those are the things which are often not considered very seriously, as you rightly pointed out in the beginning, and subsided as the non-economic factors of education. And that's something that needs to be talked about and needs to be foregrounded in the discussions.
I think the dichotomy is entirely abstract. I mean, it's just the creation of discourse, and it just keeps being confounded by the practical world. I mean, as far as I can see, higher education is a process of self-formation. I mean, we learn, we develop. Everything else is contributing to that, perhaps, but it is related to our aspirations and goals. And those goals combine the economic, non-economic, status, non-status, individual, social, and so on. And you can understand, we can re-theorize higher education in a way which talks about it as a process of self-formation, which takes in the whole of human capital theory or positional, competitional, all those things, but also foregrounds the importance of personal development and contributing to society. So that part of the self-formation process is becoming a social actor, it's becoming a citizen and a worker and all those things, and a professional, which are social processes. And so we can understand higher education and self-formation also as social formation. We form society in this process. And I think that holistic way where you enables us to get away from these dichotomous debates which hold everything back. So we're all the time debating these points, which are essentially discursive political constructions. Anyway, look, I want to thank you for the brilliant way which you presented, but also the way you handled the questions. I mean, you were succinct and clear all the way through, and that's why we had so many questions. That was a very good session. And we welcome your return to our webinar series at some point when you feel ready, to say more things to us. So thank you very much, Achala. Let me tell everyone that we have a very interesting webinar coming up on Tuesday. We're running a series of webinars on the pandemic and the impact it's having on different higher education systems around the world. And we're going to start with Australia, where a third of all the students are international, where the system depends heavily on the revenue that they generate. It's a commercial system. And where the government has stopped all incoming flights because of the pandemic. So students can't get in, and so it's online or nothing. And for some, that means they won't go to Australia after all. So Australian higher education is struggling with this on a massive scale, with all its research funding dependent on international students. So that's our discussion, led by Margaret Gardner, the president of Monash University, on Tuesday next week. So do come back then, and we'll see you then. Thank you, Achala, and goodbye, everyone.